Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in the most ordinary places. A luxury hotel lobby. A brief encounter between strangers. Words spoken in anger that reveal more about the speaker than they ever intended. What happens when privilege meets prejudice, and someone refuses to stay silent. This is the story of Margaret Chun, a billionaire real estate mogul who thought her wealth could shield her from consequences, and David Williams, a single father whose quiet strength would shake her world. In a matter of minutes, everything she believed about power, respect, and human dignity would crumble. Because sometimes, the person you choose to underestimate is exactly the one who will teach you the most important lesson of your life. Margaret Chun adjusted her Hermes scarf as she strode through the marble lobby of the Grand Tokyo Imperial Hotel. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the polished floor with the precise rhythm of someone who owned the world, or at least a significant portion of it. The 62-year-old real estate tycoon had built an empire worth $3 billion, transforming skylines across Asia with her luxury developments. Today's meeting would add another jewel to her crown, a proposed 100-story mixed-use tower that would reshape Tokyo's financial district. The morning sun streamed through the hotel's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden patterns across the pristine lobby. Margaret's assistant, Kenji, hurried beside her, tablet in hand, rattling off the day's schedule. She barely listened. Her mind was already in the boardroom, calculating profit margins and construction timelines. This deal would cement her legacy as the most powerful woman in Asian real estate. Near the concierge desk, she noticed a commotion. A small crowd had gathered around a man kneeling on the floor, frantically gathering scattered papers. Margaret's eyes swept over the scene with the detached interest of someone accustomed to observing life from above. The man was clearly African American, probably in his early 30s, wearing a simple navy blazer that had seen better days. His daughter, maybe 7 years old, stood beside him with tears welling in her eyes, clutching a small backpack decorated with cartoon characters. "Emma, it's okay, sweetheart," the man said softly, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. "Daddy will fix this." Margaret watched as hotel staff hurried past the family, their eyes carefully averted. The concierge, a stern-faced Japanese man in his 50s, stood with his arms crossed, clearly annoyed by the disturbance. Margaret could see documents scattered across the marble, what looked like legal papers, photographs, and official forms with various embassy seals. The little girl tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" she whispered in perfect Japanese, her small voice carrying clearly across the lobby. "Did I do something wrong?" Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly. The child spoke Japanese fluently, without the halting accent she expected from foreigners. "Interesting." The man looked up at his daughter, his face softening despite the stress etched in his features. "No, baby girl, you didn't do anything wrong. The taxi driver just braked too hard, and Daddy's folder opened. We'll gather everything up and still make it to our appointment." As Margaret moved closer, she could see the papers more clearly. Legal documents with the Japanese family court seal. Immigration papers. What appeared to be custody documentation. The man's hands shook slightly as he tried to organize the scattered paperwork, and Margaret noticed the deep circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped with fatigue. "Daddy's really tired," Emma whispered to herself in Japanese, not realizing Margaret could understand her. "He didn't sleep again last night. He was on the computer all night working." Margaret found herself pausing, her usual brisk pace slowing. Something about the scene pulled at a memory she preferred to keep buried. Her own father, decades ago, frantically organizing papers after her mother had thrown his business documents across their small apartment in a fit of rage. The way he knelt on the floor, gathering his dreams piece by piece while 12-year-old Margaret watched from the doorway. The concierge approached the kneeling man, his disapproval evident. "Sir, I must ask you to move. You're creating a disturbance for our guests." The man looked up, his dark eyes flashing with a mixture of frustration and dignity. "I understand, and I apologize. I just need a moment to gather these papers. They're very important. Perhaps you should be more careful with important documents," the concierge said coolly. This is a five-star establishment. Margaret watched the man's jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. I understand. We'll be finished in just a moment. She studied his face, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he spoke. There was something about his composure, his refusal to be baited by the concierge's condescension, that caught her attention. Most people either cowered or exploded when faced with such treatment. This man did neither. Emma had started helping gather papers, her small hands carefully collecting each document. "Daddy, this one has your picture," she said in Japanese, holding up what looked like a professional headshot attached to a resume. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she caught a glimpse of the resume header. David Williams, Ph.D., International Development Economics, Harvard University. Her assumptions began to crack slightly. Harvard? She moved closer, her curiosity overriding her usual indifference to other people's struggles. "Emma," David said gently, "remember what we practiced. English in public places, okay?" "Sorry, Daddy," Emma replied, switching languages seamlessly. "I just wanted to help." Margaret noticed how the little girl's accent disappeared completely when she spoke English, as if she were truly bilingual rather than simply learning Japanese as a second language. How long had they been in Japan? A hotel security guard appeared, drawn by the crowd. He spoke to the concierge in rapid Japanese, gesturing toward David and Emma. Margaret caught fragments of their conversation, something about foreigners and causing problems, and perhaps they should leave. David seemed to understand more than he let on, his shoulders tensing slightly as he continued gathering papers. But he didn't respond to the guard's conversation, focusing instead on comforting his daughter. "It's okay, Emma," he murmured. "We're almost done here." Margaret found herself stepping closer, her business instincts kicking in. She'd built her empire by reading people, by understanding the subtle dynamics of power and vulnerability. Something about this situation didn't add up. The man's education, his daughter's flawless Japanese, the legal documents with family court seals. There was a story here that went deeper than a simple tourist losing his paperwork. The concierge was growing more impatient. "Sir, I really must insist you move along. You're blocking access to the desk." David looked up, his calm facade beginning to crack. "I said I just need a moment. These documents are for a custody hearing this morning. If I lose any of them—" "That's not our concern," the concierge interrupted. "Perhaps you should have been more responsible with such important papers." Margaret saw David's hands pause in their gathering motion. His daughter looked between her father and the concierge, confusion and fear growing in her young eyes. "Daddy," Emma whispered, "are they mad at us?" It was then that Margaret's patience, never her strong suit, finally snapped. But not in the way anyone expected. "Excuse me," she said sharply in Japanese, her voice cutting through the lobby's ambient noise like a blade. The concierge immediately straightened, recognizing both her expensive attire and the authority in her voice. "Yes, madam." Margaret gestured toward David and Emma. "What exactly is the problem here?" "This gentleman has made quite a mess, and he's disrupting our other guests," the concierge explained, his tone becoming more respectful when addressing Margaret. "We've asked him to move along, but he seems to be taking his time." Margaret looked down at David, who had stopped gathering papers and was watching her with wary intelligence. She could see him calculating, trying to determine if she was going to make a situation better or worse. "And you are?" David asked quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Someone who's wondering why the staff of a supposedly world-class hotel is harassing a guest instead of helping him." Margaret replied in perfect English, her tone crisp and businesslike. The concierge's face flushed. "Madam, we don't know if he's actually a guest." "Did you bother to ask?" Margaret interrupted, her eyes never leaving David's face. She found herself genuinely curious about his answer. David stood slowly, still clutching a handful of papers. Emma moved closer to his side, instinctively seeking protection. "We're not staying here," he admitted. "We're just passing through on our way to the family court building. Our taxi had to brake suddenly, and my folder," Margaret said, her voice taking on a satisfied tone. "So you're not even a guest, and yet you feel entitled to disrupt our morning?" David's eyes flashed, and for the first time, Margaret saw real anger there. I'm trying to clean up an accident. I wasn't asking for help, just a moment of patience. Patience is a luxury, Margaret replied coolly, switching to Japanese without warning. Perhaps if you were more organized, you wouldn't need others to accommodate your carelessness. She watched David's face carefully as she spoke, noting how his expression shifted slightly. Did he understand her, or was he simply reacting to her tone? Emma tugged at her father's sleeve. Daddy, what is the pretty lady saying? Margaret felt a strange prick of conscience as she looked down at the little girl. Emma's eyes were wide and trusting, completely unaware of the adult tensions swirling around her. She was beautiful, with her father's intelligent eyes and a smile that reminded Margaret of her own daughter at that age. Her daughter. Margaret's chest tightened as unwelcome memories surfaced. Lily, at 7 years old, looking up at her with the same mixture of love and concern that Emma showed her father. Before the accident, before everything changed, David knelt down to his daughter's level, speaking softly. She's just concerned about the papers on the floor, sweetheart. Why don't you help Daddy put these in order while the nice people wait? Nice people. Margaret almost smiled at that. When was the last time anyone had called her nice? Her employees feared her. Her competitors respected her. Her few remaining friends were careful around her. But nice? She watched as David and Emma worked together, noting the practiced way they moved as a team. The little girl seemed to know exactly which papers belonged in which stack, suggesting this wasn't the first time she'd helped organize her father's work documents. Daddy, Emma said quietly in Japanese, forgetting herself again. The lady with the pretty scarf, she understood when I spoke Japanese before. Her eyes changed. Margaret's breath caught. The child was observant, more observant than most adults she knew. David glanced up at Margaret, his gaze sharpening with new awareness. Did she now? He murmured back in Japanese, his pronunciation perfect and unaccented. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. His Japanese wasn't just functional. It was flawless, educated, the kind that took years of serious study to achieve. She looked at him with new eyes, noting details she'd missed before. The quality of his blazer, despite its age, the way he held himself, the expensive watch on his wrist that she'd initially dismissed as a knockoff. You speak Japanese, she said, not quite making a question. Among other things, David replied, switching back to English. Emma, and I've lived in Tokyo for 3 years. 3 years. Margaret processed this information, her assumptions continuing to crumble. This wasn't a tourist family lost in a foreign country. These were residents, people who'd made a life here. The concierge, growing uncomfortable with the extended conversation, cleared his throat. Perhaps we could move this discussion to a more appropriate venue? Margaret turned to him with the cold stare that had silenced boardrooms full of powerful men. Perhaps you could find something useful to do instead of harassing a man who's clearly dealing with enough problems. Madam, the concierge began, but Margaret cut him off with a gesture. She looked back at David, who was watching her with a mixture of surprise and wariness. What kind of custody hearing? She asked bluntly. David's jaw tightened. That's personal. Everything's personal until it affects other people, Margaret replied. You're clearly educated, you speak fluent Japanese, and you've been living here for 3 years. But you look like you haven't slept in weeks, and your daughter is terrified. So I'll ask again, what kind of custody hearing? Emma looked up at her father, her small face creased with worry. Daddy, is it okay to tell her? She seems important. David's laugh was dry and humorless. Important people are often the least trustworthy, sweetheart. Margaret felt that barbland, recognizing the truth in it. How many people had she crushed on her way to the top? How many lives had been merely collateral damage in her pursuit of success? You're right, she said, surprising herself with the admission. I'm important by most people's standards. And you're right not to trust me. But your daughter is scared. You're clearly at the end of your rope, and you have a court hearing that could determine both of your futures. So maybe just this once, trust might be worth the risk. David studied her for a long moment, his intelligent eyes searching her face for something she wasn't sure she possessed anymore. Sincerity, perhaps, or simple human decency. Emma's mother wants to take her back to the United States, he said finally. She remarried last year. A wealthy businessman who doesn't think Japan is an appropriate place to raise an American child. Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. And you disagree. Emma was born here. She speaks Japanese better than English sometimes. All her friends are here, her school, her life. David's voice cracked slightly. I've been fighting for custody for 8 months. Today's hearing will determine where Emma spends the rest of her childhood. The lobby seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very walls were listening. Margaret found herself studying Emma's face, seeing the intelligence there, the easy way she moved between languages and cultures. A child caught between worlds, just as Margaret had been once upon a time. And if you lose? Margaret asked. Then, I have 30 days to either move back to the United States or say goodbye to my daughter forever. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret looked down at Emma, who was trying to pretend she wasn't listening while organizing papers with the careful precision of a child who'd learned that being helpful might make the scary things go away. Her phone buzzed, a reminder about her own meeting. The 100-story tower, the deal that would cap her career, the success that was supposed to fill the empty spaces in her life where love used to live. Margaret looked at her expensive watch, then at the scattered papers, then at David's exhausted face and Emma's worried eyes. For the first time in years, maybe decades, she found herself caring more about someone else's crisis than her own schedule. How long until your hearing? She asked. 45 minutes, David replied. The court building is 15 minutes away if we can find a taxi. Margaret made a decision that would have shocked everyone who knew her, including herself. You won't find a taxi in this traffic, she said briskly. You'll take my car. David blinked. I'm sorry. My driver is waiting outside. He'll get you to the courthouse in 20 minutes. Margaret turned to her assistant. Kenji, call the car around immediately. But, Madam Chun, Kenji protested, your meeting with the development consortium can wait 30 minutes. Margaret finished firmly. She looked back at David, who was staring at her as if she'd grown a second head. Unless you'd prefer to be late for the most important hearing of your life? David seemed frozen, caught between suspicion and desperate hope. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Margaret considered the question, surprised to find she didn't have a good answer. Why was she helping? It went against every instinct she'd developed over 30 years in business. Never show weakness. Never get emotionally involved. Never help someone who can't help you back. Maybe because your daughter reminded me of someone I used to know, she said finally. Maybe because I'm tired of watching good people get crushed by systems that don't care about them. Or maybe because you're the first person in 10 years who's looked at me like I might actually be worth trusting. Emma tugged at David's sleeve again. Daddy, I think she's trying to be nice. Like when Mrs. Tanaka helped us with the groceries that time. David's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter. Margaret saw the moment he made his decision, saw him choose to trust a stranger because his little girl believed in the possibility of kindness. Thank you, he said simply. I thank you. Margaret nodded curtly, already uncomfortable with the gratitude in his voice. She didn't deserve thanks. She'd spent decades earning the opposite. Kenji appeared at her elbow. The car is waiting, Madam Chun. Good. Margaret turned back to David and Emma, who had finished gathering the scattered papers. My driver's name is Takashi. Tell him Margaret Chun sent you, and he'll take you wherever you need to go. David hesitated. I don't know how to repay this. When you're hearing, Margaret said, keep that little girl where she belongs. As they walked toward the hotel's entrance, Emma slipped her small hand into Margaret's manicured one. The gesture was so unexpected, so innocent and trusting, that Margaret almost pulled away. When was the last time anyone had touched her without wanting something? Thank you for helping Daddy, Emma whispered. He's been very sad lately. Margaret looked down at the little girl, seeing her own daughter's face superimposed over Emma's features. Lily, who would have been 32 now if she'd lived. Lily, who died believing her mother cared more about business than family. Your daddy loves you very much, Margaret said softly. That's worth fighting for. At the car, David turned back to her one more time. Why are you really doing this? He asked, his voice low so Emma wouldn't hear. Margaret met his eyes, seeing the depth of exhaustion there, but also the fierce love of a parent willing to sacrifice everything for their child. Because sometimes, she said, we get a chance to choose who we want to be. And I'm tired of being the person I've been. As the car pulled away from the hotel, Margaret stood on the sidewalk watching it disappear into Tokyo's morning traffic. Her assistant was practically vibrating with anxiety beside her, checking his phone every few seconds. Madam Chun, Kenji said carefully, the development consortium is expecting us in 15 minutes. Mr. Nakamura was very specific about punctuality. They can wait, Margaret said, still staring down the street. For once in their lives, they can wait. She turned and walked back into the hotel, her heels clicking against the marble with less certainty than before. In helping a stranger, she'd somehow helped herself remember something she'd thought was lost forever. The person she'd been before ambition consumed everything else. The concierge approached nervously. Is there anything else you need, Madam Chun? Margaret looked at him, this man who'd been so quick to judge, so eager to dismiss someone based on appearance and assumptions. Yes, she said quietly. Learn to see people as human beings instead of problems to solve. It might make you better at your job. As she walked back through the lobby, Margaret found herself wondering about David and Emma. Would they make it to the hearing on time? Would David's arguments be enough to keep his daughter? And why, after years of emotional numbness, did she suddenly care so much about the answer? She didn't know it yet, but in 45 minutes, her phone would ring with news that would change everything she thought she knew about power, privilege, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Margaret's development meeting dragged on for 3 hours, but her mind wasn't on profit margins or construction timelines. She found herself checking her phone repeatedly, wondering about David and Emma's court hearing. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, negotiating a deal worth hundreds of millions, while worrying about two people she'd met for less than 20 minutes. Mrs. Chun, what are your thoughts on the environmental impact assessment? Mr. Nakamura asked, pulling her attention back to the mahogany conference table where 8 powerful men in expensive suits waited for her response. Satisfactory, she replied absently, then caught herself. These men expected her full attention, her sharp business acumen. They were offering her the deal of a lifetime, and she was daydreaming about strangers. The meeting finally concluded at noon, with preliminary agreements signed and hands shaken all around. As Margaret gathered her papers, Kenji approached with barely concealed excitement. Madam Chun, the preliminary contracts look excellent. This project could increase Chun Enterprises' portfolio value by 40%. The press conference is scheduled for 3 o'clock to announce. Cancel it, Margaret said, surprising them both. Cancel the press conference? Kenji's voice rose an octave. But the media is already assembled, and Mr. Nakamura specifically wanted I said cancel it. Margaret's tone left no room for argument. Reschedule for tomorrow morning. As they rode the elevator down to the lobby, Kenji's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, investors, and board members. Margaret ignored the chaos, her thoughts still with David and Emma. At 12:30, her curiosity finally overwhelmed her usual restraint. Kenji called Takashi, asked him about the passengers he drove this morning. Her assistant looked puzzled, but obeyed. The conversation was brief, conducted in rapid Japanese. When Kenji hung up, his expression was troubled. Madam Chun, Takashi, says he delivered the man and his daughter to the family court building at 9:45. But he hesitated. But what? There was some kind of disturbance outside the courthouse. Takashi says there were protesters and police cars. He wanted to wait and make sure they got inside safely, but the man insisted he leave. Margaret felt a chill of concern. Protesters at a custody hearing? What kind of protesters? Takashi wasn't certain. Something about foreign custody cases, international child abduction. He said there were news vans there too. International child abduction. The phrase hit Margaret like a physical blow. Suddenly, David's story took on darker implications. Was he the victim of an international custody dispute, or was he fleeing with Emma to avoid legal consequences in the United States? For the first time since she'd helped them, Margaret wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Her phone rang at 1:15, displaying a number she didn't recognize. Margaret rarely answered unknown calls, but something compelled her to pick up. Margaret Chun. Ms. Chun. The voice was David's, but it sounded different, strained, desperate. I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call. You gave me your card in case there were any problems with your driver. Where are you? Margaret asked, already moving toward the hotel entrance. At the police station near the courthouse. There's been a misunderstanding. Emma's mother filed additional charges this morning, claiming I kidnapped Emma and brought her to Japan illegally. The police are holding us until they can sort through the paperwork. Margaret's blood ran cold. Is Emma okay? She's scared, but she's safe. She's with a court-appointed child advocate right now. Miss Chun, I know you don't owe me anything, but Emma keeps asking for the nice lady with the pretty scarf. I think she trusts you. Could you possibly... I'll be there in 20 minutes, Margaret said, already signaling for Kenji to get the car. The Shibuya police station was a maze of gray corridors and fluorescent lights that felt nothing like the marble luxury of Margaret's usual world. As she navigated the bureaucratic maze, accompanied by Kenji and her personal attorney who'd been hastily summoned, Margaret found herself in unfamiliar territory. She was led to a small waiting room where Emma sat beside a kind-faced Japanese woman in her 50s, presumably the child advocate. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw Margaret, and she immediately ran to her, wrapping small arms around Margaret's waist. Mrs. Chun, you came. Emma's relief was palpable. They won't let me see Daddy. They said he might be in big trouble. Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, her heart breaking at the fear in the little girl's eyes. I'm here, sweetheart. We're going to figure this out. The child advocate, Ms. Yamamoto, approached with a warm but professional smile. You must be the family friend Mr. Williams mentioned. I'm glad you're here. Emma has been asking for you constantly. What exactly is happening? Margaret asked. Ms. Yamamoto's expression grew serious. It's complicated. Mr. Williams' ex-wife filed emergency motions this morning, claiming he violated their custody agreement by remaining in Japan beyond the specified visitation period. She's also alleging that he brought Emma to Japan without proper authorization and has been preventing her from returning to her mother. Margaret felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form. And David's side of the story? He claims the custody agreement allows him to live in Japan with Emma, that her mother voluntarily allowed the arrangement, and that the recent change in circumstances is due to her new marriage, not any wrongdoing on his part. But the documentation is complex. Emma tugged at Margaret's sleeve. Mrs. Chun, Daddy says Mommy wants to take me to America to live with her new husband. But I don't want to go. My friends are here, and my school, and Daddy would be all alone. The innocence in Emma's voice made Margaret's chest tighten. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a little girl's entire world being torn apart by adult conflicts. Can I see David? Margaret asked Ms. Yamamoto. Normally, only family members are allowed, but since you're acting as Emma's support person, she hesitated. Margaret's attorney, Mr. Sato, stepped forward. My client is a respected businesswoman with significant standing in the community. I believe an exception could be made. 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself in a sterile interview room facing David across a metal table. He looked even more exhausted than he had that morning, if that were possible. His usually careful composure had cracked, revealing the raw fear of a parent facing the loss of his child. Thank you for coming, he said simply. I know this isn't your problem. Tell me the truth, Margaret said directly. All of it. Did you kidnap Emma? David's laugh was bitter. Is that what you think? That I'm some kind of international fugitive? I think her desperate father who might have made desperate choices. I've been there myself. The admission slipped out before Margaret could stop it. David studied her face. You have children? I had a daughter. Margaret's voice was quiet. She died when she was 22. A quel accident. We hadn't spoken in 6 months before she died, because I was too busy building my empire to notice she was struggling with depression. The silence stretched between them, filled with shared grief and regret. "I'm sorry," David said finally. I can't imagine." "Tell me about Emma's mother," Margaret said, redirecting the conversation away from her own painful memories. David ran his hands through his hair. "Rachel and I met in graduate school. We moved to Japan together 6 years ago for research opportunities. Emma was born here, has Japanese citizenship as well as American. When Rachel and I divorced 3 years ago, we agreed that Emma should stay in Japan. She was thriving here, completely bilingual, integrated into Japanese culture. What changed? Rachel remarried last year. Her new husband, James Morrison, is a tech executive based in Seattle. He's traditional. He doesn't understand why an American child should be raised in Japan. He's convinced Emma is losing her American identity and will be disadvantaged when she gets older." Margaret leaned forward. "And Rachel agreed with him?" "Rachel's always been adaptable. She changes her opinions based on who she's with. When we were together, she loved Japan. Now she sees it as an obstacle to Emma's future success." David's voice carried years of frustration. "Morrison has money, influence. He's been pushing Rachel to revisit the custody agreement. Do you have documentation proving the original custody arrangement?" "That's where it gets complicated. Our original agreement was informal, done through mediation rather than formal court proceedings. We both thought we were being mature, avoiding lawyers and court battles. Now that informality is being used against me." Margaret felt her business instincts kicking in. "What kind of work do you do exactly?" "I'm an international development economist. I work with Japanese companies on sustainable development projects in Southeast Asia. My income is good, but nothing compared to Morrison's resources." "How good is good?" David named a figure that made Margaret's eyebrows rise. It wasn't wealthy by her standards, but it was certainly comfortable enough to provide well for Emma. "So this isn't about money or stability," Margaret mused. "It's about control and cultural prejudice. Morrison convinced Rachel that Emma needs to be raised in American culture to succeed. He sees Japan as inferior, despite Emma's obvious happiness here." David's anger was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. "Emma speaks better Japanese than most adults. She understands nuances of culture that take decades to learn. But to Morrison, that's not valuable. Only American achievements matter." Margaret thought about Emma's easy switch between languages, her obvious intelligence, and cultural adaptability. In a global economy Margaret knew intimately, such skills were invaluable. Morrison's attitude wasn't just prejudiced, it was stupid. What happens if you lose custody? Emma goes back to Seattle with Rachel and Morrison. I can visit twice a year, supervised. If I want more contact, I have to move back to the United States and start over. David's voice broke slightly. Emma will lose everything that makes her who she is. Her friends, her language skills, her connection to Japanese culture. She'll become just another American kid who happened to be born overseas. And if you win, Emma stays in Japan with me. Rachel gets visitation rights, but Emma's primary residence remains here. She continues in her Japanese school, maintains her friendships, grows up bilingual and bicultural. Margaret leaned back in her chair, processing the information. This wasn't the clear-cut case she'd initially imagined. David wasn't a kidnapper or a deadbeat father. He was an educated, financially stable parent fighting to preserve his daughter's multicultural identity against pressure from a stepfather who apparently couldn't see beyond his own cultural biases. What kind of evidence do they have against you? David pulled out a folder, the same papers that had scattered across the hotel lobby that morning. Morrison hired investigators. They found that I'd taken Emma on several trips within Asia over the past year. Research trips where she came along during school breaks. He's claiming those were attempts to hide her from Rachel, evidence of my intent to abduct her permanently. Margaret scanned the documents with the sharp eye of someone accustomed to legal complexities. The papers told a story of a loving father sharing his work and travels with his daughter, but she could see how they might be twisted by an aggressive attorney. What about Emma's preferences? She's old enough to have an opinion. That's the irony. Under Japanese law, Emma's wishes would be heavily considered. She's articulated clearly that she wants to stay in Japan. But Rachel's attorney is arguing the case under American jurisdiction, claiming Emma's too young to understand the long-term implications of her choice. Margaret felt a familiar anger rising, the same fury that had driven her to build her business empire, the rage against systems that silence the powerless. How long do you have? The preliminary hearing is in 2 hours. If the judge rules that this should be tried under American jurisdiction, Emma and I both have to return to the United States immediately for proceedings there. Game over. And if the judge rules for Japanese jurisdiction, then we have a chance. Emma's voice gets heard, her connection to Japan gets considered, and the focus shifts to what's actually best for her rather than Morrison's cultural prejudices. Margaret stood abruptly. I need to make some phone calls. Ms. Chun, I can't ask you to get more involved. You've already done so much. You're not asking, Margaret interrupted. I am deciding, and I've decided that I don't like bullies, whether they're wearing expensive suits or hiding behind legal technicalities. As Margaret left the police station, her mind was already racing through possibilities. She had contacts throughout Japan's legal and business communities. More importantly, she had the one thing David lacked, the kind of influence that could open doors and change minds. But first, she needed to understand exactly who they were fighting. In the car, she turned to Kenji. I need everything you can find on James Morrison. Business background, financials, legal history, personal connections. I want to know what we're dealing with. Madam Chun, Kenji said carefully, this level of involvement in a stranger's legal case is unusual. Are you certain this is wise? Margaret looked out the window at Tokyo's bustling streets, thinking of Emma's frightened face and David's desperate courage. Wise? Probably not. Necessary? Absolutely. As they drove toward her office, Margaret's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant's research. What she read made her blood run cold, and her resolve hardened into steel. James Morrison wasn't just a prejudiced stepfather. He was something far worse, and Margaret was about to find out exactly how far some people would go to get what they wanted. Margaret's office occupied the entire 40th floor of the Nakamura Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Tokyo Bay. Normally, the sight of the city she'd helped reshape filled her with satisfaction. Today, she barely glanced at the skyline as she pored over the research Kenji had compiled on James Morrison. The picture that emerged was troubling. Morrison wasn't just wealthy, he was strategically connected. His tech company, Morrison Digital Solutions, had contracts with several government agencies. More concerning were his personal associations. He served on the board of a conservative think tank that promoted American cultural preservation and opposed what they called the dilution of American identity through excessive multiculturalism. Look at this, Margaret said to her legal team, pointing to a series of articles Morrison had published. He's written extensively about the dangers of raising American children in foreign cultures. He genuinely believes that Emma's bilingualism and cultural adaptability make her less American. Her attorney, Mr. Sato, studied the documents with growing concern. This explains the legal strategy. They're not just fighting for custody. They're making an ideological statement about cultural identity. Margaret's phone buzzed with another update from a research team. This one made her stomach turn. He's done this before, she said grimly, reading the report. Morrison's first wife had a daughter from a previous marriage. The child was living with her biological father in Canada when Morrison married the mother. Within 6 months, he'd convince his wife to pursue full custody and relocate the child to the United States, cutting off contact with the Canadian father entirely. Is this legally documented? Mr. Sato asked. Settlement sealed by court order, but my sources found traces. The Canadian father fought for 2 years before giving up. The daughter was 12 when she was forced to move. She's now 19 and estranged from both her mother and stepfather. Margaret felt a chill of recognition. This wasn't about Emma's best interests. It was about Morrison's compulsive need to control and reshape families according to his narrow worldview. Emma was just his latest target. Kenji appeared in the doorway, his face pale. Madam Chun, there's something else. I just spoke with a contact at the American consulate. Morrison's attorney filed additional paperwork this morning, claiming that Mr. Williams has ties to anti-American organizations in Japan. What kind of ties? They're claiming his research work with sustainable development organizations is actually supporting groups that oppose American business interests in Asia. They're trying to paint him as unpatriotic. Margaret's anger flared white-hot. She'd built her fortune working with international partners, understanding that global cooperation was essential for modern business success. Morrison's xenophobic paranoia wasn't just wrong. It was economically ignorant. "Give me a direct line to Judge Watanabe," she ordered. "I want to speak with him personally." "Madam Chun, Mr." Sato cautioned. Direct contact with the presiding judge could be seen as improper influence. Judge Watanabe and I serve on the Tokyo Business Ethics Council together. I'm not calling as an interested party. I'm calling as a fellow council member who has concerns about cultural prejudice affecting legal proceedings. The call was brief, but illuminating. Judge Watanabe was indeed aware of the broader implications of the case. Morrison's legal team had been aggressive in their cultural arguments, essentially claiming that any American child raised primarily in Japan was being culturally damaged. "The case troubles me," Judge Watanabe admitted. "The child is clearly thriving in Japan, but the mother's attorney is arguing that cultural identity trumps individual well-being. It's a complex legal and ethical question." "Your Honor," Margaret said carefully, "I've had personal interaction with the child in question. She's remarkably well-adjusted, intelligent, and bicultural in the best possible way. It would be a tragedy to force her into a monocultural environment simply to satisfy ideological preferences." "You've met the child?" Margaret explained the morning's encounter, emphasizing Emma's obvious happiness and cultural adaptability. "Emma represents the future, Your Honor, a generation that can bridge cultures and create understanding across boundaries." Morrison's arguments aren't just wrong legally. They're harmful to Japan-U.S. relations generally. After the call, Margaret sat quietly in her office, watching the afternoon sun reflect off Tokyo Bay. Her involvement in this case was already far beyond anything she'd ever contemplated. She was risking her reputation, her business relationships, and her carefully constructed public image for a family she'd known for less than 12 hours. But every time she considered stepping back, she saw Emma's frightened face and remembered her own daughter's final words, "Mom, you never fight for anything except money." Her reflection was interrupted by a commotion in the outer office. Through her glass walls, she could see Kenji arguing with someone, a tall, well-dressed American man with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes. Margaret didn't need an introduction to know she was looking at James Morrison. "Send him in," she told Kenji through the intercom. Morrison entered her office with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. He was handsome in a conventional sense, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of expensive tailoring and professional image consulting. "Ms. Chun, I'm James Morrison. I believe you've involved yourself in a family matter that doesn't concern you." Margaret remained seated, a power move she'd learned decades ago. "Mr. Morrison, how interesting that you come to see me personally. I would have expected you to work through legal channels. I prefer direct communication," Morrison said, taking a seat without being invited. "I understand you helped my stepdaughter and her father this morning, and you've been making inquiries about our family situation. I helped a frightened child and her father gather scattered papers. As for inquiries, I make it a practice to understand situations before forming opinions." Morrison leaned forward, his smile sharp. "Let me save you some research time. David Williams has been systematically alienating Emma from her mother and American culture. He's turned that little girl into a stranger to her own heritage." "Interesting perspective," Margaret replied coolly. "From what I observed, Emma seems remarkably well-adjusted and intelligent. She speaks multiple languages and navigates different cultures with ease, skills that most adults spend years trying to develop." "Those aren't skills," Morrison snapped, his polished facade cracking slightly. "They're confusion. Emma doesn't know who she is or where she belongs. She needs stability, American education, and proper cultural grounding. By proper cultural grounding, you mean exclusively American cultural grounding. Emma is an American citizen. She belongs in America, surrounded by American values and opportunities. Margaret stood and walked to her window, forcing Morrison to turn to follow her movement. Another subtle power play. Mr. Morrison, I've spent 30 years building international business relationships. In my experience, people who can navigate multiple cultures and speak multiple languages aren't confused. They're invaluable. You're asking that child to give up advantages most people would kill for. You don't understand, Morrison said, rising to face her. This isn't about business advantages. It's about identity, about knowing who you are and where you come from. And who decides that? You? A man who married into this family 6 months ago. Morrison's eyes hardened. I'm trying to save that child from becoming a cultural mutt with no real loyalty to any country. The phrase hit Margaret like a physical blow. Cultural mutt. The casual bigotry behind those words revealed everything she needed to know about Morrison's motivations. I see, Margaret said quietly. And I suppose you consider me a cultural mutt as well? Chinese heritage, American education, Japanese business success. I didn't say you didn't need to. Margaret's voice carried the ice-cold authority that had intimidated boardrooms full of powerful men. You've revealed exactly who you are, Mr. Morrison. A small-minded bigot who sees cultural diversity as a threat rather than a strength. Morrison's face flushed red. You have no right to judge my family decisions. I'm trying to protect Emma from exactly the kind of confused identity that creates people like me. Margaret interrupted. Successful, independent, globally minded people who don't fit neatly into your narrow definitions. I'm trying to give Emma a normal American childhood. You're trying to erase half of who she is, Margaret said flatly. Emma was born in Japan. She spent most of her life here. Her father is providing her with every opportunity to succeed in an increasingly global world. You want to destroy that because it doesn't match your prejudiced idea of what an American child should be. Morrison stood abruptly. This conversation is over. You don't know what you're talking about. On the contrary, I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know you've done this before to your first wife's daughter. I know you've systematically isolated children from their non-American family connections. And I know you're using your money and influence to destroy a loving father-daughter relationship because it doesn't conform to your bigoted worldview. Morrison's mask slipped completely. You arrogant bitch. You think your money gives you the right to interfere in American family matters. Margaret smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth. Actually, I think my money gives me the resources to stop bullies like you. And Mr. Morrison, you've just made this personal. After Morrison left, slamming the door behind him, Margaret called an emergency meeting with her legal team, her public relations specialists, and her most trusted business advisors. If Morrison wanted to fight, she'd give him one, but she'd fight with every weapon at her disposal. I want a complete investigation into Morrison Digital Solutions, she ordered. Financial records, government contracts, business practices, everything. If he's using his position to bully families, I want to know about all of them. Her PR director, Ms. Tanaka, looked concerned. Madam Chun, a public battle with an American businessman over a custody case could damage your reputation in certain circles. Then, we make sure we win decisively, Margaret replied. I want Morrison's pattern of behavior exposed. Contact investigative journalists, family rights advocates, anyone who might be interested in a story about wealthy Americans using their influence to destroy international families. Mr. Sato cleared his throat. Madam Chun, this level of involvement could backfire. If we're seen as interfering in legitimate legal proceedings, there's nothing legitimate about using prejudice and financial pressure to separate a child from a loving parent, Margaret interrupted. Morrison just showed his true colors in my office. He's not fighting for Emma's welfare. He's fighting to impose his bigoted worldview on a multicultural family. Over the next hour, Margaret deployed resources she'd never used for personal causes. Private investigators, legal researchers, media contacts, and business intelligence specialists all received urgent assignments. If Morrison thought his money and connections made him untouchable, he was about to learn otherwise. As her team dispersed to begin their investigations, Margaret found herself alone in her office with an unexpected visitor. Emma stood in the doorway, holding Ms. Yamamoto's hand, looking small and lost in the vast space. "Emma, sweetheart, what are you doing here?" "Ms. Yamamoto said I could see you before the hearing," Emma said quietly. "I wanted to ask you something important." Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, her heart breaking at the fear in the child's eyes. "What is it, sweetheart? If the judge says I have to go to America, will you still remember me?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Daddy says sometimes when people go far away, other people forget about them." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, something that hadn't happened in years. "Oh, Emma, I could never forget you. Never. Will you tell Daddy that even if we have to go away, he's the best daddy in the world? And that I don't want to live with Mr. Morrison because he's mean to Daddy, and he says my Japanese words are stupid?" The innocent revelation hit Margaret like a thunderbolt. Morrison had been directly undermining Emma's cultural identity, calling her bilingualism stupid. The man wasn't just prejudiced. He was psychologically damaging a 7-year-old child. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "has Mr. Morrison said other things about your Japanese language or your life in Tokyo?" Emma nodded, tears starting to fall. "He says I talk funny, and I'll never be a real American if I keep speaking Japanese. He told Mommy that Daddy is making me weird and foreign." Margaret's rage crystallized into cold, focused determination. Morrison wasn't just fighting for custody. He was systematically trying to destroy a little girl's sense of self. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, pulling Emma into a gentle hug, "there's nothing weird or wrong about who you are. You're perfect exactly as you are, Japanese and American, bilingual and brilliant. Don't let anyone tell you different." As Ms. Yamamoto led Emma away to prepare for the hearing, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't just going to fight Morrison in court. She was going to destroy him completely. Because some battles aren't about winning. They're about making sure the bullies understand that their victims aren't powerless. And Margaret Chun was about to show James Morrison exactly how much power one determined woman could wield. The Tokyo family court building hummed with tension as Margaret arrived with her legal team. Word had somehow leaked about the high-profile custody case involving an American tech executive, and news vans lined the street. Margaret recognized the orchestration immediately. Morrison was trying to turn this into a media spectacle, using public pressure to influence the proceedings. But Margaret had been playing media games since before Morrison graduated college. "Mrs. Chun," a reporter called out as she approached the courthouse steps, "is it true you're personally involved in this international custody dispute?" Margaret paused, her media training kicking in automatically. "I'm here to support a child's right to maintain her multicultural identity and her relationship with both parents. Every child deserves that protection." The simple statement would lead the evening news, framing the narrative exactly as Margaret intended. This wasn't about American versus Japanese custody law. It was about children's rights and cultural acceptance. Inside the courthouse, Margaret found David sitting alone on a bench, staring at his hands. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "I still don't understand why you're doing this," he said quietly. "After Morrison's visit to your office, Kenji told me you could have just walked away." Margaret sat beside him, an action that would have shocked her employees. She rarely sat with equals, never mind people she was helping. 25 years ago, my daughter Lily went through a phase where she was fascinated by other cultures. She wanted to learn Mandarin, study abroad, experience the world beyond our privileged bubble. David listened quietly, sensing the pain beneath her controlled exterior. "I discouraged her. I told her that focusing on foreign cultures would distract her from building a successful career in America. I said she needed to concentrate on what would make her competitive in American business." Margaret's voice grew quieter. "I was wrong. About everything." "What happened?" Lily rebelled, of course. She studied international relations in college, learned 3 languages, spent summers working with humanitarian organizations overseas. I saw it as wasted time, frivolous pursuits that wouldn't help her in the real world. Margaret stared straight ahead, lost in painful memories. We argued constantly. I kept pushing her toward business, law, traditional American success. She kept insisting that understanding other cultures was essential for the future. David remained silent, understanding that Margaret needed to tell this story. The night before she died, we had our worst fight ever. She'd been accepted into the Peace Corps, wanted to spend 2 years in Southeast Asia. I told her it was a waste of her education, that she was throwing her life away for meaningless idealism. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. She said I was exactly the kind of narrow-minded American that made the rest of the world hate us. She said I couldn't see past my own prejudices long enough to recognize that her generation would need to be global citizens, not just Americans. She was right, David said gently. Yes, she was. And I was too proud and too blind to admit it. She died believing I thought her dreams were worthless. Margaret turned to look at David directly. Emma is everything Lily wanted to be, bicultural, bilingual, equally at home in multiple worlds. Morrison wants to destroy that because it threatens his narrow worldview, just like I destroyed Lily's dreams because they threaten mine. Before David could respond, the courtroom doors opened. Margaret watched as Morrison emerged with his legal team, followed by a woman she immediately recognized as Rachel, Emma's mother. Rachel was younger than Margaret had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of recent wealth and careful styling. But it was the expression on Rachel's face that caught Margaret's attention. She looked miserable, conflicted, nothing like the confident co-conspirator Margaret had imagined. Morrison spotted Margaret and David immediately, his face darkening with anger. He strode over his expensive suit and commanding presence intended to intimidate. Williams, he said coldly, ignoring Margaret entirely. I hope you've prepared your daughter for disappointment. This circus ends today. David stood slowly, his calm dignity in sharp contrast to Morrison's aggressive posture. Emma's prepared for honesty. Morrison, something she's not getting from her mother's new family. Don't presume to lecture me about family values, Morrison snapped. I'm trying to save that child from the confusion you've inflicted on her. Margaret rose to stand beside David, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic. Morrison was tall and imposing, but Margaret's aura of controlled power was unmistakable. Mr. Morrison, she said with icy politeness, I've been looking into your background since our conversation yesterday. Fascinating reading. Morrison's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means your concern for Emma's welfare seems remarkably similar to your concern for your first stepdaughter's welfare. Tell me, how is Amanda doing? Still estranged from her mother at 19. The color drained from Morrison's face. That's none of your business. Actually, it became my business when you decided to repeat the same pattern with Emma. Margaret's voice carried clearly in the courthouse corridor, causing other people to turn and listen. Isolating children from their non-American family connections, using financial pressure to force custody changes, systematically undermining multicultural identities. It's quite a pattern. Rachel stepped forward for the first time, her voice uncertain. James, what is she talking about? You said Amanda chose to live with us. Margaret saw the crack in Morrison's facade and pressed her advantage. Amanda was 12 when your husband convinced you to pursue full custody from her Canadian father. The sealed settlement records show a 2-year legal battle that ended only when the father ran out of money to fight. Amanda attempted suicide twice during her teenage years and hasn't spoken to either of you since she turned 18. That's enough, Morrison snarled, but Margaret wasn't finished. The pattern is clear, Mrs. Morrison, Margaret continued, addressing Rachel directly. Your husband has a compulsive need to erase non-American influences from the families he joins. First Amanda's Canadian connections, now Emma's Japanese identity. The question is whether you're going to let him destroy another child's relationship with her father. Rachel looked stricken, glancing between Morrison and David with growing understanding. James, You told me David was preventing Emma from seeing me. You said he was trying to turn her against American culture. I am protecting our family, Morrison said firmly, but his confidence was wavering. By calling Emma's bilingualism stupid, Margaret asked pointedly, by telling a 7-year-old that her cultural adaptability makes her weird and foreign. Emma told me about those conversations. Mrs. Morrison, your husband is psychologically damaging your daughter. Rachel's face went white. Emma told you what? David stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. Rachel, Emma's been trying to tell you for months that Morrison makes her feel ashamed of who she is. Every time she speaks Japanese, every time she mentions her friends or her school here, he criticizes her. She started having nightmares about being taken away from everything she knows. That's not true, Morrison protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma asked me yesterday if I would still remember her if she had to go to America, Margaret said quietly. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to worry about being forgotten by the people who care about her. She shouldn't have to choose between her parents or deny half of her identity to please a stepfather. Rachel stood silently for a long moment, tears starting to form in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Emma really said her Japanese was stupid? Morrison reached for Rachel's arm, but she pulled away. Rachel, don't let them manipulate you. These people are using Emma to attack our marriage. Are they? Rachel asked, looking directly at her husband. Because everything they're saying matches what Emma's been trying to tell me for months. I thought she was just resistant to change, but you're starting to see the truth, Margaret said gently. Your daughter isn't confused about her identity. She's being forced to choose between parts of herself that should coexist harmoniously. Morrison sees her multiculturalism as a threat because it challenges his narrow view of what American children should be. Rachel turned to David, her expression anguished. David, I'm sorry. I thought. James convinced me that Emma needed stability, American schooling, a traditional family structure. I thought you were being selfish by keeping her in Japan. I was being a father, David replied simply. Emma thrives here, Rachel. She's happy, successful, surrounded by people who love her exactly as she is. Why would we destroy that? Morrison's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling before their eyes. Other people in the courthouse corridor had stopped to listen, drawn by the intensity of the confrontation. Margaret noticed several Japanese court officials watching with obvious interest. This case had implications beyond one family's custody dispute. This is ridiculous, Morrison said desperately. Rachel, remember what we discussed. Emma needs American values, American education. Emma needs love and acceptance, Rachel interrupted, her voice growing stronger. She needs parents who celebrate who she is instead of trying to change her. Margaret watched the shift in dynamics with satisfaction. Rachel wasn't a villain. She was a confused mother who'd been manipulated by a controlling husband with racist ideologies. Mrs. Morrison, Margaret said carefully, it's not too late to do the right thing for Emma. She loves both her parents. She should be able to maintain relationships with both of you without being forced to choose between her American and Japanese identities. Morrison realized he was losing control of the situation. Rachel, if you back down now, will never be able to give Emma a proper American upbringing. She'll grow up confused, displaced, never truly belonging anywhere. Like me, Margaret asked pointedly, confused and displaced by my multicultural background, unable to belong anywhere. She gestured to the expensive courthouse around them, the obvious markers of her success and influence. Mr. Morrison, the future belongs to people like Emma, those who can navigate multiple cultures, speak multiple languages, build bridges instead of walls. Rachel looked at Morrison with new eyes, seeing clearly for the first time the man she'd married. James, listen to yourself. You're talking about Emma like she's defective because she's bicultural. But that's who she is. That's what makes her special. I'm trying to give her advantages. You're trying to take advantages away from her, David said firmly. Emma's bilingualism will serve her throughout her life. Her understanding of Japanese culture will open doors that most Americans can only dream of. Her ability to move between worlds will make her invaluable in any career she chooses. Morrison made one last desperate play. Rachel, if you don't support me on this, our marriage shouldn't depend on destroying my daughter's relationship with her father, Rachel said, her voice now steady and clear. If you can't love Emma as she is, then maybe our marriage was a mistake. The courthouse corridor fell silent. Margaret watched Morrison's face cycle through anger, disbelief, and, finally, defeated rage. He'd lost, and everyone present knew it. Fine, Morrison's narrowed. But don't come crying to me when she grows up unable to function in real American society. Real American society includes millions of bicultural, multilingual people, Margaret said calmly. Maybe it's your definition of American that needs updating, not Emma's identity that needs changing. Morrison turned and stalked away, his expensive shoes echoing angrily against the courthouse floor. His legal team hurried after him, clearly understanding that their case had just collapsed. Rachel stood watching her husband leave, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to David. "I let him convince me that loving Emma meant changing her. I was wrong." David stepped forward and, after a moment's hesitation, pulled Rachel into a gentle hug. "Emma needs both her parents, Rachel. She always has. But she needs parents who love all of who she is." Margaret watched the reunion with a mixture of satisfaction and unexpected emotion. This was what victory looked like. Not the destruction of enemies, but the restoration of broken relationships. As they prepared to enter the courtroom for what would now be a very different hearing, Emma came running down the corridor with Ms. Yamamoto close behind. "Daddy, Mommy," Emma called out, then stopped short when she saw them standing together. Are you friends again?" Rachel knelt down and pulled Emma into her arms. "Yes, sweetheart. Mommy made some mistakes, but we're going to fix them. You're going to stay in Tokyo with Daddy, and I'm going to visit more often so we can all be a family again." Emma looked between her parents with the cautious hope of a child who'd been disappointed before. "And I don't have to live with Mr. Morrison?" "No, baby," Rachel said softly. "You never have to worry about that again." Emma turned to Margaret, her small face serious. "Mrs. Chun, did you help make this happen?" Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, seeing in her eyes the future Lily might have had, multicultural, confident, love for exactly who she was. "You helped make this happen, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, "by being brave enough to tell the truth about who you are and what you need. That took real courage." Emma threw her arms around Margaret's neck, whispering, "Thank you for fighting for me." As they entered the courtroom together, David, Rachel, Emma, and Margaret, the proceeding that followed was a formality. Judge Watanabe officially granted David primary custody, with Rachel receiving generous visitation rights and both parents sharing decisions about Emma's education and upbringing. But the real victory had happened in the courthouse corridor, when a mother chose love over prejudice and a family chose to embrace complexity instead of forcing simplicity. Standing outside the courthouse an hour later, watching David and Emma reunite with friends who'd come to support them, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction that came from fighting for something bigger than profit. Her phone buzzed with messages from business partners, reporters, and board members, all wanting to know about her involvement in the custody case. Tomorrow, she'd face questions about whether her actions were appropriate for someone in her position. But today, watching Emma laugh as she switched effortlessly between Japanese and English while talking to her friends, Margaret knew she'd made the right choice. Some victories were worth more than money. Some fights were worth the risk. And sometimes, the person you save ends up saving you right back. 6 months later, Margaret Chin stood in the same hotel lobby where her life had changed direction, but everything felt different. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers remained unchanged, but the woman who walked through them had been fundamentally transformed by the events that began with scattered papers and a frightened little girl. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Margaret waited for her guests to arrive. Today marked the opening of the Chun Foundation for Multicultural Family Support, an organization that would have been unthinkable to her just half a year earlier. The Foundation's mission was simple but revolutionary: to provide legal and financial support for families fighting to preserve their multicultural identities against prejudice and discrimination. David and Emma were the first to arrive, and Margaret's heart lifted at the sight of them. Emma had grown taller, her confidence restored, her smile bright as she chattered excitedly in both Japanese and English about her school's international festival. David looked rested for the first time since Margaret had known him, the stress lines around his eyes softened by months of security and peace. "Mrs. Chun," Emma called out, running across the lobby with the fearless energy of a child who no longer worried about being separated from those she loved. "Did you see the newspaper article about Daddy's new job?" Margaret smiled, remembering the article that had run in the Tokyo Business Journal the week before. David had been promoted to senior economist at his firm, largely due to recognition his work had received during the highly publicized custody case. His expertise in international development and his ability to navigate complex cultural situations had made him invaluable to companies seeking to expand their Asian operations. "I did see it, sweetheart," Margaret said, kneeling to Emma's level as had become her habit. "Your daddy is helping companies learn to work respectfully with people from different cultures. That's very important work. Just like you're helping families stay together," Emma said seriously. "Daddy explained about your foundation. You're making sure other kids don't have to be scared like I was." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Emma's wisdom reminded her of the daughter she'd lost. But now the pain was mixed with something new: pride, purpose, and the deep satisfaction of meaningful work. Rachel arrived next, and Margaret was struck by how much she'd changed as well. Gone was the uncertain woman who'd been manipulated by Morrison's prejudices. In her place stood a confident mother who'd fought her way through a difficult divorce to reclaim her relationship with her daughter. Rachel now lived in Tokyo for half the year, working remotely for her American marketing firm while maintaining her connection to Emma's daily life. "Margaret," Rachel said warmly, using the first name that had once seemed impossible for anyone to use casually. "The Foundation's launch has been incredible to watch. The applications for assistance are already pouring in. 23 families in the first month," Margaret confirmed. "Cases from all over Asia. American-Japanese couples, Korean-German families, Filipino-Australian children caught in custody disputes. It seems Morrison's prejudices are more common than I realized." The Foundation's first major case had made international headlines. A Canadian mother in Singapore was fighting her ex-husband's attempt to relocate their bilingual children to rural Alberta, where they would lose access to their Mandarin education and Chinese cultural connections. With the Foundation's support, she'd won a landmark ruling that established children's rights to maintain their multicultural identities. David joined their conversation, his expression serious but hopeful. The legal precedents we're establishing could change everything for mixed-culture families. Courts are starting to recognize that forcing children to choose between parts of their identity constitutes a form of harm. "It's not just legal precedents," Margaret said thoughtfully. "It's changing the conversation entirely." When Morrison tried to frame Emma's case as American versus Japanese values, he was using an outdated paradigm. The future belongs to people who can bridge cultures, not those who insist on cultural purity. Judge Watanabe approached their group, his normally reserved demeanor brightened by genuine warmth. He'd become an unexpected ally of the Foundation, using his influence within Japan's legal community to promote understanding of multicultural family issues. "Mrs. Chun," he said formally, though his eyes twinkled with amusement, "I believe you have another surprise for us today." Margaret smiled mysteriously. "Actually, I do. But first, I want to tell you about a letter I received this week." She pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper, its creases showing it had been read many times. "This is from Amanda Morrison, James Morrison's former stepdaughter, the one whose Canadian connections he severed when she was 12. The group fell quiet, understanding the significance immediately. She heard about Emma's case through news coverage and reached out through the Foundation's website. She wanted to thank Emma for being brave enough to fight for her multicultural identity, something Amanda was forced to give up. Margaret's voice grew softer. She's 20 now, working as a translator for international refugee organizations. She says she finally found a way to use the cultural knowledge Morrison tried to erase. Has she reconnected with her Canadian family? David asked gently. That's the beautiful part, Margaret replied. Through the Foundation's Family Reunification Program, we've helped her locate her biological father. They're planning their first meeting in 8 years next month. She says Emma's story gave her the courage to reclaim the part of herself that was stolen. Emma looked up with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. So by fighting for me to stay with Daddy, we helped another girl find her daddy too? Sometimes, Margaret said, fighting for what's right creates ripples that help people you've never even met. As they moved toward the Foundation's new offices in an adjacent building, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. The real estate empire that had once consumed all her energy now felt like just one part of a larger purpose. She still closed deals and built towers, but the Foundation had become her true legacy. The Foundation's headquarters occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office building, with conference rooms named after successful multicultural families and a children's area designed to welcome families during legal consultations. The walls displayed artwork from children around the world, celebrating the beauty of cultural diversity. Margaret's new assistant, Ms. Tanaka,